Okay, now for a very important chapter, apparently the Corinthians had written to Paul asking him about marriage and not getting married, which one's better, and all of this. And Paul is in this chapter here addressing these issues. Now, concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. This would have been very important advice for the Corinthians, in whom, as we went over in the very first chapter, Corinth was riddled with prostitution, fornication. They actually grouped such lewd acts into their worship of these demon gods. So Paul says, in order to avoid fornication, get married. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. I found that David Guzik, he had really good commentary on this, especially the first part of this chapter, so I'm going to go to him quite a bit in this. This does not justify a husband abusing or coercing his wife sexually or otherwise, that the husband has power over her body, because remember, she also has power over his body. And Paul is just emphasizing that we have a binding obligation to serve our partner with physical affection. Defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not. One of the main reasons why you're getting married is to avoid going out here and having sex with all kinds of other people. Do not deprive one another, Guzik once again. Paul rejects their idea that husband and wife could be more holy by sexual abstinence. In fact, harm can come when they deprive one another, as they open the door to the tempter. Sexual deprivation in marriage has not only to do with frequency, but with romance also. This is why Paul tells husbands to render to his wife the affection due her. Deprivation in either sense gives occasion for the deprived to look elsewhere for fulfillment and to destroy the marriage. God will permit, reluctantly, as a concession, a married couple to abstain from sexual relations for a short time for the sake of fasting and prayer. But if this concession is used, it is only to be for a time, and then husband and wife must come together again in a sexual sense. Do remember this. Now, this is a very good comment for all couples. Satan's great strategy when it comes to sex is to do everything he can to encourage sex outside of marriage and to discourage sex within marriage. It is an equal victory for Satan if he accomplishes either plan. And Paul continues, clarifying, but I speak this by permission and not of commandment, meaning that this is a general instruction and should really be taken on a case-by-case basis. For I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. Now some take this in the former, that Paul was never married, and others that Paul is a widower, that he once was married, and since his wife either left him because he became a Christian or because she died early on of whatever. We do know that Paul, it does speak of him casting his vote against Christians, signing death notes, if you will, before he, of course, converted to Christianity. But it does speak of him being able to cast his vote, which meant that he was high-ranking within the Sanhedrin, or at least part of them. He was really coming up, probably was going to be the next Gamaliel, the next great Pharisee of the Jews, ironically. But if indeed Paul was of such high rank, it's almost an obligation for him to be married. So most scholars believe that he probably was married and then something happened and he just lived out the rest of his life as a widower. I personally believe that he was never married, but that's just me. I don't know. I very well could be wrong. So Paul says if you're unmarried or a widow, or a widower, then remain as such. If you have that gift and can abstain or contain, as it goes on with this next verse, but if they cannot contain, let them marry. If they have those urges and they just find it too difficult to suppress, because it is a gift to not give in to those urges. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, because Jesus never did mention about unbelievers. What Jesus was saying about if you leave your wife and marry another, then you're committing adultery, that was under the assumption that everyone was a Jew, because he was speaking to the Jews, and that everyone was of God, everyone was a believer. But Paul, he's mentioning the unbelievers right here, which is why he makes mention that this is not from the Lord. This is not something that you would hear the Lord have said. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. Now notice how Paul says that the unbeliever is sanctified by the believer. He doesn't say justified in any way. Sanctified in this context does not mean that the unbelieving spouse is saved just by being married to a Christian. It simply means that they are set apart for a special working in their lives by the Holy Spirit, by virtue of being so close to someone who is a Christian. Verse 15. Now it's very important that you all note this. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister a Christian is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. Charles Ellicott noted at this point, the apostle has carefully reminded his readers that our Lord's command does not apply to the case of a marriage between a believer and heathen, as I've already noted. In such cases, we have no command from him. If the unbelieving spouse should depart, the Christian is not under bondage to the marriage covenant. This means they are in fact free to remarry because God has recognized their divorce as a valid divorce. Verse 16. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? If thy unbelieving consort wishes to depart, let him go, so that thou mayest live in peace, as noted at the end of the previous verse. For thou canst not be sure of converting him, so as to make it obligatory on thee at all costs to stay with him against his will. You don't know if he's going to convert or not. There's no sense in trying to stay with him if he wishes to leave. Verse 17, but as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk. And so ordain I in all churches. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. To which Paul goes on to clarify, art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. You're truly free in the Lord. Likewise, also, he that is called, being free, is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. Yet I give my judgment as one that hath obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. Now what does Paul mean? He's meaning that marital life brings about its own problems. He says, and I would spare you from those worldly issues that naturally come from being married to another. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none. And of course, many have taken this out of context and they said, look, if I'm married, I now just act like I'm not married. That's not what Paul is saying. This does not mean that they are to treat them with unkindness or neglect or fail in the duties of love and fidelity. It is to be taken in a general sense that they were to live above the world. But alas, how many professing Christians live for their wives and children only, and not for God in these relations? Verse 30, and they that weep, as though they wept not, and they that rejoice, as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy, as though they possessed not. He's saying, live otherworldly. Don't go in the same wave that this world is going, because it's going for certain destruction. And they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that you may attend upon the Lord without distraction. Now from verse 36, here it's speaking of that of parents and their daughter. But if any man, a father, also including the mother, but if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him what he will do. He sinneth not, let them marry. And this was apparently one of the questions from the parents in Corinth regarding their unmarried daughters. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. And this is where it would truly help to know the question that the parents had asked Paul in order to get more details. But Cambridge noted, having no necessity, it says. This might be the case either if the maiden be not specially desirous for the married life, or if her hand be not sought in marriage, or if when sought she be unwilling to accept the proposal. So all of that's referring to, nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, and that's referring to the virgin, whoever it may be, but hath power over his own will, meaning that his judgment is unselfish in this matter, and that's why he'd rather his daughters stay and live with them. You know, it's not out of a selfish nature, like she helps with feeding the animals or in the vineyard or something like that. It's an unselfish thing. So he would rather stay the guardian over his daughter for her own good will, not for his own, but for her own good will. Verse 38, so then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better, because she can stay a virgin and focus on spiritual things. The wife, now on to another subject, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she so abide, after my judgment. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God. And of course he does, or else this wouldn't have been added in the Bible. So even Paul at times, he wasn't 100% certain if it was the Spirit inspiring him, but he even comes to that. But he's saying she's happier if she can stay away from fornication and keep those urges at bay and just serve the Lord.